Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Zoom discussion. We are going to have Grant Lastiwka talking on the economic side of perennials. Just some housekeeping notes here. If you guys wouldn't mind renaming yourself and putting where you're from so we can know where everyone's joining us from tonight. In order to do that, you just click on the three blue dots on the top of your name and hit rename, and you'll be able to type in your location. And from there, I don't think there's anything else from me, and I will let Grant take things over and he will share his screen.
My sunlight's kind of blocking my eyes here. My apologies. Okay. Is that showing, Amber?
Yes, it is. You're all good to go.
Okay, what an exciting topic. Pasture, perennials, economics. I can't say enough about all those things considering how dry it's been and concerns many of us have as we head into the year. And when it comes down to it, of course, I've tried to put the economic side together in a way in which it can be everybody's understanding. It's a challenge so often when we use numbers, they become our numbers and our understanding for everybody else to watch and not understand. So I've tried to stick a little bit bigger picture in that as we pull it together. And I'm going to put things in a bit of perspective, because when I think of perennial economics, perennial forage economics, I also think of opportunity cost. And I look to the future in terms of production. I look at it in terms of also dollars and cents on it, and looking more into the future. The one thing I wanted to emphasize and promote a little bit of some of the new thinking. Soil and grazing, biology, not geology. 40 years ago, when I went to university, we spent a lot of time on geology, and you can't make soil quickly. It takes hundreds and thousands of years. The reality of it now, we know that it is a lot from roots and root exudates. And that side is something I've worked on quite a while, my past life and a bit in my present. But the point of all of that is this is a wealth point to me that is important. It is an economic point that is important. And it is an opportunity here in September of this year as Manitoba puts on their regenerative efforts. And we work with them too in Western Canada, the Forage and Applied Research Associations, and Graham and myself are both on this committee. What I'm looking at here in my own mind is something that to me is an oversight. And when we look at Wrenching for Profit, Dave Pratt, and the work before him and Stan Parsons, and now it's moved even a third generation, we're looking at the fact that it really is a series of things. It's from the healthy land to the families and to the profit center and the profitable business. And the key thing to me here is that your bottom line is very important. And as an organization, Union Forage, since everybody is a producer, they're all people that are thinking in terms of economics and why it's important, but they're also looking at things above and below. This was a term that we coined a number of years ago, and the idea above it was that, pun I guess, above it, profit above and wealth below. The idea is our future is in the soil. Our wealth, we know, can be managed and enhanced into the soil, but if we do not be able to make a living doing it, if we can't cash flow, who's going to pay for it? And Graham emphasized that last night in the fact that nobody is paying for it. So you've got to be on top of things. And that's, as an organization at Union Forage, we emphasize the profit side pretty strongly, never forgetting that the fact the future is in the soil, the wealth below. And there's a lot of excitement around the soil health. And we're there too, very excited about it, but we look at it in perspective. I've got the take home for you right here. So those people that feel they have to leave because they got a cow calving can be looking at taking it home right now. If you wanted to have a look at this, if you feel you want to take out your cell phone, take a picture of it, you're more than welcome. And Amber is recording this, so it will be going up on our website. But the point is, so much of a cow or a sheep, any animal for that matter, feed is a huge cost. And that's why putting efforts that way is so important to economics. When we look at the fact that half of that is winter feed and feeding system, and that feeding system is why people, when they said, well, you know, bale grazing isn't grazing. Well, if depending on how you manage it, it is a grazing mentality. And all of a sudden that shifts the economics in the whole picture to be more favorable than a feed delivery system all winter. It is in fact a feed placement at one time for use over time. And the reality is, once we start looking at economics of perennial forages, the grazing day is so important because it is less cost. And I gotta say there that it can have other sides to it, because I have worked on economics on 365-day grazing, and Owen Nelson and I did it ourselves is from Alberta Data when we put together that publication. And when it came right down to it, the idea that if you want to look at a trend, if you want to look at your system, the reality of the economics, there is a huge opportunity for savings here. Why there is, and that's important, because if in fact we can save some costs, when we do, if it's $1, one of the things Harlan Hughes had said many years ago was that $1 savings in feed was a leverage adding a $2.58 profit. So the idea that we cut $1 in fact allows us to make $2.58. That was back 20 years ago, I think, almost 15 at least. The point of that is it leverage and opportunity. And from that standpoint, if we've got that, now we have a multiplier effect to put elsewhere. We might choose to put it into wind shelters that are portable. We might choose to put it into rejuvenating a pasture or other things. So we can invest in a stronger, more profitable future as well, to take profit and use it, in fact, in a manner that allows for the addressing and increasing. As we know in the holistic management, they say, is it an A, B, or C expense? And the idea behind it is it an expense where you're going to invest to make more money, or it is an expense where we're going to, in fact, not make more money, or is it one which actually costs us money? But cost effectiveness, in my mind, I really believe being on top of things, keeping track of your grazing management records, having that as part of your planning, all addresses the potential for no surprises. Every good manager doesn't like surprises. And with that in mind, if we've got records we can plan from, planning in pencil, very important, because a lot of people will say, well, I did my plan and it didn't work. No, it never will. But you will be so much closer to your outcomes if you have a tactical plan in place, like ranching for profit or holistic management. Both talk about it from a standpoint of tactical planning and doing it in pencil, and then using the monitoring. So the other thing, proper stocking rate, nothing works if it doesn't fit. And that's the point of it. We have to have the stocking rate that is in line with productivity. And if it isn't, and we need to deal with it and deal with it promptly or before the fact. Rest recovery, water, fences. Graham talked about this last night some, and I'll talk about this and dwell on it a little bit to show you some pointers in where I see things. And certainly there's other ways of looking at it. Years ago, when we started looking at the opportunities over a full season, and right now I've called it 250 plus days, but the mentality around it could well be 365. And as a friend of mine said, it's a 365 grazing day mentality. It doesn't mean we achieve that, but we'll come a lot closer to it if we actually put our thinking hats on, our economic hats on, and for every day we get closer to that, it's $1 in our pocket. It's $2.58 in leverage. We've got a number of opportunities and alternatives to look at. And one of the things you will see that with Union Forage, it's always thought of that we need to have a really strong perennial pasture. And that amounts to being the species or the management. And as Graham focused last night, adaptive grazing, controlled grazing, as Jim Garish and Ellen Nation used to call it, management hyphen small I for intensive and a big G for grazing. So the idea with it is it can be a number of things, but it all comes back to thoughtful grazing and managing in a way that is going to be more flexible to meet the needs. One person said to me when I was doing this talk a little bit a while ago, they said, you know, you kind of missed the point, because where does the cow come in here? Aren't you going to decide? Can't you decide to put her in a place where, in fact, costs could be lower? Absolutely true. I don't have to feed her with a ration that is so high in requirements when green grass is present, as I do when no green grass is present, and the cost to do so is greater. We're not saying don't calve there, because many people with community pastures and pasture leases of other forms, communities, or for that matter, it could be crown leases, they have to calve at certain times for different reasons. And the weaning side's one we're going to talk about too as we go, because it's an opportunity to deal with an animal with a calf at side and not split the pair apart and incur costs for both. Let's keep them together and incur maybe 3/4 of the cost, not a full cost from both of them being costed to us. Work done in Saskatchewan by the Forage Council many years ago put a perspective on it. And they said, you know, if you want to put your money where your mouth is, forages are where you do it in a cattle business. A friend of mine also looked at it another way. He said, you know, we always say it doesn't grow if it doesn't rain. But what you see here, in fact, is that we've got a situation where environment or rain, 40% of the story is what Gordon had said. And the point of it is so much of the management we employ, the species, drought avoiders, species that can tolerate drought, species that respond rapidly after drought, are all very important for managers and options. And the fact that if it doesn't rain, let's have the species that can bounce back when we get a bit of rain. What if we managed well? So that in fact, we've got better water infiltration, a better water cycle, and lo and behold, then when we're out short of water, it isn't as detrimental because we've got, as Graham talked about last night, residual or armor on the land to prevent the drying out of soil, the heat on the soil being revolved up onto the plants. The thing about it is this is kind of putting it in perspective. Yes, nothing grows if it doesn't rain. But at the same time, when the economics or the production, if you want to call it, instead of economics, was actually studied, the realization was that with healthy, vigorous pastures, in a drought, the production fell about a half. But when pastures were in fact caused to be stressed further from management where plants weren't vigorous and not healthy, then the magnitude of it was a greater time and doubled even. So that is important to remember with it. One thing that bothers me a lot is I'll often hear rangeland agrologists saying, just use a low stocking rate, continuous grazing. It's a grazing system that is every bit as good. Well, the problem with low stocking rate is that low stocking rate is just this inverse. High stocking rate, high profit, low stocking rate, you're telling me I should have a low profit. I can't afford a low profit and stay in this business. If the land doesn't give me more because of management and everything all coming together and yet it doesn't, yes, maybe that is the highest stocking rate I can have. But the majority of the time, you will find that people that manage their grazing will have higher stocking rates and higher profit per acre. The thing to watch here is that it can't be stocking rates that are out of line, because if that stocking rate is in fact higher than the potential carrying capacity of the land, and that high carrying capacity of land, moisture, fertility, management, as we talked about earlier, it doesn't add up. And if it doesn't add up, you're an overgrazer and your pastures are going to go backwards versus forwards. So what can we do about that? Just putting perspectives on economics, bigger picture thinking. And it's like somebody when they tell me, if you're grazing corn, all of a sudden I'm thinking in my head, I know I need 220 cow days an acre, unless I've got quite a bit of fertilizer that is present in the ground, because I know the costs are quite high with that. And it's not bad or good. It's just a fact of trying to understand. Higher stocking rate allows for higher profit. The majority of our growth as we move into Canada from the US and into northern parts of these provinces in Canada are that this is even more true. The majority of our growth comes very early in the year. So if somebody says, well, I hope it rains soon, and this is the end of June, I'm sorry, the writing's on the wall. July rains after that June 21st, longest day of the year, are rains that do not have the leverage, do not have the impact. And so that's why you'll see many with drought plans that are very rigorous through June. And they're knowing that their time is quickly ending for when a rain will make the big difference and matter it does. Certainly we can do some things about it with a higher legume potentially in a pasture, and we'll talk about that responds later in the year pretty well as well. But the idea that these rains are the big ones that decisions are built around. The idea of getting out too early in the spring, this needs to be looked at a little carefully. There's more to this story. It's actually said by Hugo Gross out of Brandon. That's where the one day in the spring loses 2 days in the fall, 3 days in the fall of grazing. It depends is the answer. And the exciting thing I find is if we manage our pastures well, if the rain does come in this stretch, and we are still going to have a better plant response, because vigorous plants do in fact compensate. What I'm going to say that in the fall, this is one thing in my mind that's determining productivity. We realize more and more that perennial pastures set up productivity in the fall when they're in fact building that solar panel. That solar panel is creating baby tillers that are tiller buds. So plants within plants, if you want to call it that. But the idea is it's setting up next year's growth, next year's yield as feast or famine. If we don't allow for adequate solar panel as August becomes September, the plant starts thinking famine, and its yield will reflect the fact less tillers will be developed, less potential for next year already, because as the saying is, the writing's on the wall is what the plants do, because they physiologically need to start in initiating processes that happen with the hours of daylight dropping, and they do so in a manner that August, September, such is very important to next year. In the spring, grazing readiness. When do you start grazing? When the solar panel's big enough that it doesn't need a battery. If you think of solar panels connected to batteries so they can run electric fences or water systems, the point of that is that once the sun's out and it's a great day, there's times where you can just roll right along and the battery isn't even needed. This is true if we get to the 3-leaf stage on a tame stand, 3.5 on a native stand. The plant is telling you it's ready. So you grab the top leaf on the plant and then you kind of shake it so you separate it, follow down that stem, that leaf to the next, to the point where it's connected to the stem, and then reach down, grab that, and put your hand a little further down. You're counting leaves on that tiller as you go down. If you've got the 3 to 3.5 leaf stage, the plant's telling you the writing's on the wall. It's ready to be grazed, and you can graze it. Planned grazing using records is one of the biggest steps to economics because it's decision-making based on facts. But if I think this year's going to be drier than last year, it's simply a good, solid tactical plan in pencil. I'm looking at it from the standpoint of getting things in balance before I start. And that grazing record book tells me the animals, it tells me the forage supply in terms of animal days of grazing that I had on the land. It also is something that is functioning based on rest, because rest really is recovery. So the need for plants to recover from a previous incident when animals removed part of them, removed part of their sugars, part of their nitrogen, part of their minerals, all of that has to be recouped. If it isn't, the plant goes down instead of going up. What do you see wrong with this? When I pulled out my grazing notebook, I started putting my numbers down. I found that if I wanted to graze those 100 animals for 250 days, then 250 times 100, 2,500 animal days of grazing. I had gone back to my record book. I had said, ooh, some pastures I was a little hard on. I don't think they'll be as good as here. So I adjusted them back a little bit. All of a sudden, I'm short. I'm short what amounts to being 9,250 animal days. So I won't graze 100 animals for 250 days. I've got to find I've got a shortfall of 9,000, which is almost, when you're looking at it, a third roughly. So I'll be out of grazing days for those 100. I either sell 30 animals, so I'm down to about 60, 65, or reducing a third so I can match this, or I plan to graze less. The fact is that it's not in balance. It won't work. And what's going to get slammed? It's going to be rest. It's rest, and rest is expense into the future, because we look at perennial pastures as pastures that have a memory. And that memory is what allows them to be more resilient, but at times it carries forward into the future with a lag. Pasture economics, one of the best things to do to address a positive pasture economics, a positive beef cattle economics, is having excess grazing. And later season growth is almost always required in that situation. And if we're managing pastures for high forage growth, doing so thoughtfully using records and other things, it's quite conceivable we will get productivity increases. And that's where in the initial start, when Stan Parsons and Dave and Ellen Savory were first in Canada with Ranching for Profit, with holistic management before that even, they then said you could double. Well, I don't say double because my thought on it is that I don't know if my land has been at a high degree of productivity to begin with. If I'm concerned, I say there's real opportunities by managing to increase productivity. And that's why at times we'll up our management game. We spent a lot of last year moving cows every day. And we moved them every day so that we could control their grazing incidents and really manage and stay on top of them to get as much out of pastures without detrimentally damaging those pastures. So right away, that is something that's very important, that we're going to, in fact, go ahead and manage accordingly. If we're unhappy, how can we deal with this? Is it reseeding? Is it fertilizing, and with high fertilizer prices? But the idea is to look forward into the future and try to make some plans. Many years ago, when I was unhappy with one of my pastures and I felt it was on some of my best land, I quickly went ahead and said, you know what? I'm going to pull the plug on it. And I did. And it was the pasture I went to last year when the cows came home from the other pastures. Why? Because I had a biodiverse group of legumes in there. And of course, legumes are drought avoiders. They also supply nitrogen to the system, which improves efficiencies. And so when we have legumes at about 40 to 50% of a stand, they function at a high degree of effectiveness. It doesn't have to be 100%. We're not saying that. In fact, I don't want that. But if it's 30, if it's 40, if it's 50, those are all gains that are really important to think about. I wanted to put this down to re-emphasize it. I am looking at the 3 to 3.5 leaf stage recovery in the spring. I am then simply leaving a lot of solar panel behind, 67%, maybe 75% with a first grazing over. This is an ideal world. This is a rule of thumb. This is to drive home a point. What you do with it, we can have a long talk on why and what. But the reality is we're just harnessing it a little bit at a time when it is starting to grow and it is going to have a life cycle of putting up a seed head. Well, let's take the seed head and convert that to a bunch of babies. And so instead of that, we've got a bunch of mutillers. If we remove that control, that dominance within the plant to produce a seed head, by going out there and removing a portion of it, it doesn't adversely affect it. In fact, it shifts, moving that seed production carbohydrate, in fact, into a regrowth of other forage seedlings within that. So a plant within a plant, tillers, more tillers coming, more density of green on the ground, a higher leaf area index, as some people would say. My second time over in my systems, I often say in my system, yes, I can graze my bale grazing ground more. Yes, I can graze a new stand more. Maybe I can graze a high legume stand more. But so often I'm planning on a 1.5 time. 1.5 because every year I look at how I do it, and to get the highest productivity, production, stocking rate, high profit, economics, I could have my cake and eat it too when I in fact use a twice over system. And the 1.5 mentality simply reflects the fact the first time I graze it lightly, the second time I'll come back, it has to be, cows have to be somewhere. So in July, they might be grazing a pasture to 1/2 to 3/4, or it could be late June, but it's usually, for me, it's the middle of July. I kind of finish my first pass over system. And then a lot of my others are on the shoulders of the year. So they're in September, October, November, and that's, or the following spring. And that's why I say ours is a 1.5 time, because a lot of our pastures, we aim for having less animals and more grass, so we can have more profit per cow and in general come ahead of the game. The important thing is it looks different to everybody. This is our pasture that's got a lot of saline salts and everything. So You get one good growth out of it. So our management on it is to alternate the way we do it. So we create forage mass, we go in there and we'll remove a lot and then get the heck out of there. So the idea is each is a different story to itself, and we have to manage accordingly. And with this pasture, the one time over gives us the highest productivity, and we alternate which pasture they're on. So if they're on this in July, next year they're going to be over there in the background someplace in July. This will be grazed either in September to alternate. So we'll alternate how we do things so that pasture never gets the same time, the same severity. What I wanted to share is some work that was done out of Manitoba many years ago. So MB for Manitoba, 5 sites over 2 years, looking at pasture yield under a grazing system. As we talk economics, well, would I rather have 2,500 roughly pounds of yield, or would I rather have 1,000 pounds of yield? 943, I'm rounding to make it easy. The point of that is that if I put some effort into it, I put some management into it, lo and behold, I've got a lot extra productivity to that situation. And that's why we say to people, it could be well rewarded. These were rotational grazing producer pastures back in the early 2000s, over 2 years, work done by Don Green at that time. He then took those same pastures and incorporated fertilizer on some of them. What they went and did was added 50 pounds of nitrogen to that pasture. And you can see the difference, about 1,600 pounds of yield. So the 50 pounds of nitrogen gave you around 31 pounds of forage yield per pound of actual N. When I looked at this in February at $1,250 per ton, I saw that of urea, 4600. That worked out to 4 cents a pound of forages. You know what? I'm paying more for hay than that. I think I maybe can afford to fertilize this and get the productivity. If I got 31 pounds, I caution people here, if it is a pasture that's been grazed really hard and doesn't have a good degree of vigor and health, you don't get rotational and fertilizer magnified like this unless this pasture would not become that pasture. This, in fact, number reflects something that is true potentially of a highly vigorous forage stand. I feel a little more comfortable with 20. And if I have to change this by a third, so now I'm up to about 6 cents a pound of forages. But you know what? I still don't have to start a tractor to deliver it and other things. So maybe fertilizer does pay. That's a point to this of the discussion. And the emphasis was on fertility. The emphasis also reflects the fact that manure and urine, and as I think Graham maybe said last night, we'll touch on that in a minute. I am looking at a soil profile because I know if my numbers are below this on a soil test, 0 to 6, 6 to 12 depth, I probably got some things. If my potassium's not this high, Saskatchewan's well known for high parent material potassium. They sell it to other people. But if Alberta or Ontario or Quebec or others, what are your potassium levels? If they're not 300 pounds, chances are a little bit of potassium would not be hurting you in trying to address a deficiency. So not all nitrogen is the point. You are trying to get numbers into a balancing point. The reason I say it is this, because years ago, when I was looking and doing drought talks, I in fact found some interesting things. Work in Southern Alberta at the time showed that adding nitrogen to the soil and adding phosphorus allowed for a fancy word. Well, what does that mean? It meant that when we added the nitrogen, about 45 pounds, And the 45 pounds of product, it wasn't even actual, gave about a 57% higher yield. So that was the study. That's a 57 number I grabbed from their study. So the point of that was that using that nitrogen really boosted yield a lot. When they looked at simply adding phosphorus, lo and behold, they got only 11 pounds of yield increase from putting 25 pounds of phosphorus, if I remember correctly, on. But you know what's funny about that? They put the two together. And here's where math comes in. 57 plus 11 equals 120. So I know Roger's on this call and Amber from Union Forage, and they say, Grant, your math's bad. But the point of it is that it's synergy. And that's what they found when they actually did things. So address what's deficient, address it in a balancing thinking. And when you do so, the point of that was they did not have a deficiency in sulfur or potassium. So that, to me, I don't want to say it's only important nitrogen and phosphorus. The reality is they weren't deficient in that. The other thing that's interesting is they actually found a shift. And this is where fertilizer comes in. Do I want more of a broadleafed grass like smooth brome that's deeper rooted than Kentucky bluegrass, which is a fine leaf grass? Then I better consider putting some phosphorus. If I use straight nitrogen, what was found in Melfort, Saskatchewan, was the fact that it encouraged more grass, more yield, but it was more Kentucky bluegrass that was making up the yield than when it had the combination of nitrogen and phosphorus. So again, I'm looking at not straight economic. I have to have more than that. I'm looking at shifting a plant stand productivity, just as I would for a legume. What if I'm unhappy with the amount of legume in my stand? Somebody says, I'm really unhappy. I want a sod seed. So often you'll hear us at Union Forage say, what's your soil test say? Because we're looking at it from a standpoint of what's the weak link. And if a little bit of phosphorus made you look like you had a lot of alfalfa there, maybe that's what should be done instead of trying to seed more. Just address the weakness in the system. And with that, what I wanted to show here is a system, and this was done at Melfort in Saskatchewan. And continuous grazing, not fertilized, was looked at in terms of from 1977 to 85. So we're talking about 8 years. And I'm going to look at these bottom numbers. That's the averages. So on the continuously grazed system, the average was around 1,160 pounds of yield. Well, when you planted some posts and when you fertilized, but I'm not looking at fertilizer right now because it's over here. I'm looking, or my apologies, I am looking at it here, but I'll look at this in a second. But post and fertilizer, what they found was having more pastures. It jumped to 2,500 pounds of yield over 1,160. So rotationally grazing, if you want to call it, some added fertility did increase the yield 1,400 kilograms per hectare, something in that range of pounds per acre, roughly the same. So there was a benefit to having 6 even versus 4. So that was what they found. The interesting thing though, too, is they only fertilized every year and a half. So if I fertilize this fall, next fall, you don't get fertilized, you get fertilized the next fall. So on average, you fertilize what amounts to being every pasture on alternate years. So an 18-month previously, the productivity, the point of that was fertilizer has a hangover effect, if you want to call it that, or an improving of vigor. So the productivity of fertilizer, if we manage our animals for urine and manure to be back in the land, we have an added bounce of fertility that is in fact on average higher than it would be if it wasn't fertilized. This is where we start looking at fertilizer, because to me, to be honest with you, I don't apply fertilizer. It doesn't mean you shouldn't. or I wouldn't. I have. There are times when I do, but I haven't for a while. When I looked at the winter, what was coming out of a cow net to the soil, because 37% of the urine nitrogen and manure nitrogen was recaptured. So in this number, we've got nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. But because so much of the phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur is returned anyway, interesting thing was when the animals urinated on the land in wintertime, they had, in fact, a 35 to 45, and I grabbed 37 to use it. Actually, it was 32, I think, to 45. That's why 37 is about close to the average. But more of my urine nitrogen is recaptured. Important thing to know here, when that was done at Lanigan by Paul Youngnitz and Bart Lardner and Jeff Shano from Saskatchewan share the results often, they found that the manure and compost, when put on the land, didn't return 37% of the nitrogen. It only returned 1 to 3%. That's why keeping animals out on the land, 37% of nitrogen returned, giving this number net to the soil with a balanced ration for a beef cow in winter, 66 cents coming out of her net to the soil, and that efficiency. In summertime, more of the nitrogen is recaptured. It's recaptured more so in green canopies. Up to 99% can be grabbed by leaves. So in summer, of course, we've got a higher quality ration. We've got a cow with a calf at side. And so I have her eating about 30 pounds here. Here she's eating around 45, 40. And when she's doing that of a summer ration with more of the nitrogen returned, that's why we don't want cows walking into water bodies, because their tails go up too often. In it comes on one end, out it goes on the other. I need that back on the land. I don't want to have that in a set of trees because there's shade. I want it to go back on the land, but that's the kind of fertilizer value. So it's not just applying fertilizer, it's manure and urine of the cow, well thought out, well managed to get the biggest bang for your buck. What do legumes do as another fertility alternative? And this yellow blossomed alfalfa, when we're looking at this outside, you can the color of the grass difference, yield difference, and it's not just the snow in this picture because we took it from the other side too. What was found is a legume, and in fact with the legume, if there's 30 to 60% legume in a stand, it doesn't have to be 80 or 100. The yield was about 80% of 100 pounds of nitrogen, but the economics were more similar. So a legume is a very cheap fertilizer is the point. I don't have to put 100 pounds of N on if I've got 30 to 60% legume in a stand. And that's because they help with the grass nitrogen requirements in a number of ways. We won't talk about all tonight. But they essentially provide a high quality yield, but they also feed the grasses. The performance of the cattle goes up from a higher quality and the higher quantity available at any point in time. It also gives us a drought avoidance mechanism because the tap roots, the deeper roots, the hydraulic lift of those legumes as they pull water up during the heat of the day from greater depths adds to yield stability of the entire stand as they release some of that water back at night into the rhizosphere or top of the ground. So what does water being used more in the soil add to? It adds to a longer season of growth and a longer stability. What I wanted to say is when cow-calf producers in Alberta, so this is Alberta data only, from the years of 2004 to 2010, put their numbers forward for economic analysis. When they did, at that time, the economist, Dale Khalil, said to them, I'm going to ask you about your pastures. And so Dale was so great to ask questions and collect data from them. They said, well, we don't really have as many records, but he had their income tax. When did you put them out? Oh, yeah, we put them out on June 10th. Oh, okay. When did you pull them? Okay. How many cattle did you have in that group? Well, there were 2 bulls, so there was 50 cows. Okay. And so Dale collected all these numbers. What he found was that, in fact, he had on the land a 25% more production, more grazing days, 31% more profit per acre from a grass legume pasture when compared to tame grass alone. So what you're showing here is that greater production potential that I just shared with you on that other slide was actually achieved by all the people that were cow-calf producers through the 6-year period, contributing their data if they had grass legumes to compare against tame grass. From 2013 to 15, we were involved in a higher legume pasture project. I was part of that along with others. We called people, I called people and said, would you contribute your numbers? You graze more legumes, I know, than a lot of people. Would you be willing to be part of the cow-calf producer survey? And if you are, I would thank you very much and I'd appreciate it. So for 2 years, we added more people with more grass legume pastures. So it's a biased number, but what it shows you is, in fact, so true. We got, in fact, through the course of those 2 years versus the previous 6, an increase in grazing days and an increase in profit. Remember the $1 to $2.58, the leverage factor. So the point of this, though it's only Alberta data, it's Alberta cow-calf producers across the province from the Peace to Southern Alberta. So it gives us some, what are your numbers? I don't have them. I don't want to try to go through a bunch of numbers to confound things. So that's why we picked out the highlights. What we also found here to emphasize, and work done by Blazer, was no nitrogen, 200 pounds of nitrogen. Look at the yields. And when you're looking at that in terms of animal, my slide, per acre pounds of live weight gain, no fertilizer, 200 pounds of fertilizer, legume, no legume. Again, our numbers are more similar. What a point of all of this is, legumes need to be used. If you want higher production, use legumes. And this is up in the Peace Country, and it's one of our dealers up there's Pastures. And the fact is that that high legume in the fall and this high productivity, you can see the animals coming in. Another one of our customers from out near Holden, and this was taken October 1st. The next day the snow fell. But lo and behold, up until that time, and these were his gummer cows, he called them. They were all the old crocks. So when you notice this girl showing some rib, she's probably 14 years old. But you can see the calves. Higher legume pastures October 1st. That's certainly something that we'd appreciate. And thanks to Elgar and Annie Grindy for this picture that Karen Lindquist took. But the fact is, legumes do pay. People say to me, you can't afford it. Ranching for profit, Dave Pratt used to say, you can't afford to take a pasture out of production. And in my own mind, I thought, you know what? How long do I do this if I think a pasture's not productive enough? Excuse me. We looked at an example in light of, what if I took it out of production and swath grazed it? I think Grant earlier had said that, you know, when the animals are being grazing, it's $1 a day savings. And swath grazing, that was about 50% savings over conventional feeding systems back in the 90s when the Western Forage Beef Group looked at it. So I grabbed that. And, we sprayed it in August. Can't forget that cost. Now glyphosate would have a higher cost, but it was cost and application of $30. So $30, and I'm setting myself up to swath graze next year. So Oh, first thing in the spring, I hit it with glyphosate again, a lower rate. I don't need as much. But the fact is that fall, in the same cash flow years, I grazed it after I used glyphosate this year, in year 0. The second year, I swath grazed it for 100 days. That's better than the majority of our pastures, actually. So if I had $1 a day over traditional savings, it means I put $100 in my pocket. I'll look at these costs in a minute. The second year I went back with glyphosate again. Now the soil had mineralized more. I had higher yield. The swath grazing yield at 150 days. This is just an example. It is not reality, but it is very possible and real in a lot of parts of this provinces across Canada. Doesn't mean it's true for southern parts, and the northern parts might well be higher. The point is, after these 2 years of time, I had 150 and $100 in savings, so that's 250. Take off my costs, $50, $70. So I've got 250 minus 70. I've got $180 saved in cash flow within operating loans years, not money out of pocket because I've grazed instead of fed. So I've saved this money versus having to traditionally feed. And with that, I now have $180 to spend on reseeding to a more productive legume pasture mix with grass. This is the point. If you look at costs, look at it from a standpoint of thoughtfulness. Really, as we're getting through this, we're seeing the fact that it is important to look at things in light, and I want to be timely for this year in economics. And so it's fair to say to not talk economics and yet not plan for what I see coming. I know if I beat up my pastures last year, I have a story being told. And when people say to me, it won't grow if it doesn't rain, absolutely true. But tell me what you did last year, and I can tell you what your yield's going to be, because it won't be if it was deprived of vigor and went into the winter with very few babies potentially to grow, famine. So remember back to that earlier part of time. We have to look at it thoughtfully. And when I look at my pastures this year as part of my planning, I will be putting them in there if they were managed well and left careful, did what I had to, maybe grazed them a little too severely, but they still were left with a lot of vigor. I expect them to get compensatory gain like you would on a backgrounding animal on my pastures, because we're seeing some of the numbers of mineralization in the soil and nitrogen that is potentially there to give us yield, but it doesn't happen unless we have vigor in the plants. And the emphasis in the spring, if we have to start grazing before the third new leaf per tiller, you are really going to hurt that pasture. As late in the fall grazing, if it doesn't leave enough solar panel, those plants go into winter in a state of not having a downfill coat, but not having any clothes on themselves. And they go into a winter and the hardship of the winter and severity of the cold in winter. So that emergency grazing we do leaves a bad taste in their mouth for next year. So in finishing and taking it home, I really think we need to look at what we can manage in this time we have, and for control of those situations, and looking at the plants in terms of how can we manage them or consider the future, and not forgetting the soil health. And part of that is manure and urine too. So my thought on that is soil health is a healthy, vigorous plant feeding the system, but it's also manure and urine going back. And so it's always a flux. I'm not about to say it's going to be stable, but I'm getting more of dynamic, stable stability, and I'm really investing into the future. I'm investing from profit and input above and below ground from the standpoint of forage vigor, forage health, and the standpoint of a nutrient cycle below ground functioning at a high level. So the grazing principles in any manner is really rest and recovery. It is planning based on previous knowledge. It is also looking further so that we can control the situation and put a dollar where it's going to return $1.20, $1.50, $2. Put our dollars in the right place where we can get that leverage we want. So I'm going to stop there, Amber, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, for sure. So there's been no questions so far, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or turn on your camera or pop your questions in the chat box. And there's lots of us on the call that would love to chime in or help answer.
So, hi, Grant. I'm PJ Kimmel. I'm from down here in Turner, Montana, northern Montana.
Hi, PJ.
Yeah, see, so I've swath grazed annuals and work very well over the winter. My question is swath grazing perennial, grass, alfalfa. You know, we normally hay in July, so I'd be swathing this stuff down in July. Would that work for, you know, winter swath grazing? The swaths would lay there all summer, lay there, you know, until winter feeding. I'm too chicken to try that because I think my windrows would blow away first, but the feed nutritional value, you know, they're going to lay there as long as they don't blow away. I mean, what's your thoughts on that? Is there guys in Canada that are swath grazing perennials like that, or?
There definitely are. However, there's less than started doing it and trying it. I'm going to make some comments and then I'm going to ask Sean McGrath to step in here, if you don't mind, too, Sean, getting ready. In Nebraska, there was a bunch of work done on it, and they found that it actually works reasonably well, and that was on their meadows they had there. The idea is that it's going to kill grass under it, but it's less of an area than you think. And it is a bit of a haystack in itself. So it, depending on how wet and how much rain you've got, the challenge I think people found with it that was disappointing was the fact that it doesn't have the stubble to hold it a bit up off the ground. And the concern that in fact, if you get a really wet fall, you get more deterioration on it. And with that in mind, laying it down so early and knowing you've got such a long window of risk in front of you is something that I myself just generally, people were doing it with straight legumes after the ground froze in Manitoba. I know another fellow out towards Edson up here in Canada that was doing it on his second growth. So he took his first as silage, then came back and did it for his second. So all of those translated into a later laydown of it for less exposure to weather elements. Sean, you do some of this. Do you want to explain a little bit and what's your take on it? I have no problems. You tell me I'm full of what.
Yeah, we've like on the perennials, we do we will usually take a grazing pass early on and then let it recover, and then we generally don't cut it until, well, we'll be September, mid-September. The other thing we've done that's probably kind of freaky is we have an old steel wheel dump rake, and we'll actually pull those windrows into piles, and I actually prefer that. It's if we have snow events, it's easier to get through, and the work we've done where we've dug into those piles in December and January, the quality is actually better than if we'd have baled it. And it's worked really well for us, and it's cut our costs well, I'd be embarrassed to tell you how cheap it is to winter cows that way.
PJ, do you want to ask any questions of Sean?
No, he's got a good point there. I mean, they put it in piles. I'm just looking at the cost savings of bale grazing, you know, putting twine on it, running over with the baler. You know, if you could put it in piles like he's talking, I think that makes sense, you know, so that's a good point there.
We're actually looking at the point of looking at renovating our hay sweep from, I don't even know when the last time we used it, but we think that might be a solution for us as well, just sweeping it up into piles.
So you're going back a long ways. And I remembered when I was talking about bale grazing at Quesnel, BC, this old gentleman came up and he said to me, you know, this is nothing new. And when you start looking at, and PJ, I know you know some history on your areas, and many years ago, that was, people put up hay in meadows. They made stacks as best as they could. They brought the cattle to it. And then along came the Hestons and the John Deeres with their stack wagons after the McKee that came out before it. And so people did a number of things, but all of that reflects the fact that you won't get as much deterioration as you think. And molds are not mycotoxins until they are. And usually we had a toxicologist that I worked with for a bit, and he'd laugh at me and say, Grant, we're not in Kentucky like I was from, or Tennessee. He said, there's a lot more opportunity here. And the idea that you have so worried about problems is probably a little too much worry. Sean,
Right.
any closing comments on that, or PJ?
I guess I was just, you know, I got some old hay fields that we've always hayed, and I've converted some of them into annuals to get better feed, and we would be swathing them down, you know, September, first part of September instead of July. Like the perennials in our country, we kind of need to swath them down when we're getting the best nutrients in the plant, but just so they don't dry out and the grasshoppers don't eat it, you know. So there's just kind of a timing issue with the perennials here, as far as getting the best feed value. That's why people put it up in a hay bale in July, you know, capture the best feed value. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out how to do that, I guess. So you answered some good questions though. So.
No, I think you've got some good ideas there with possibilities too. And certainly Sean's sharing appreciated, because I think that, yeah, the manure and urine on the land back in those areas where the hay's coming off of, being fed off of, going back to it, much more highly efficient at 37. It's actually, I think, 32 to 45 that Paul Youngnitz had, versus if you took it to the yard and then brought the manure or compost back and got 1 to 3% of the nitrogen.
Yeah, very true. We've taken the hay off of this land for 30 years in a round bale and never put nothing back into it, you know, so we can keep everything on that land, take the cows to the feed and let them, you know, do their job. So it's kind of what I'm looking at now. So.
Amber, we'll pass it back to you. Do you have more questions or not?
Ryan asked a question here. Is there a better way to fertilize pastures than to broadcast it? When you seed legumes into an existing pasture, should you use more phos fertilizer to encourage the legumes?
Always encourage a soil test to know what you've got, because staves in a barrel, what is the most deficient becomes the best addressed for the highest impact. We kind of know nitrogen's always going to be deficient. And in my own mind, that's something that in soil tests, I expect to find low numbers. If I find high numbers, as some of us are on annual land this year, it's because of the amount we put on and the fact that we didn't get very much growth to use that mineralized material. And the fungi is a little more drought tolerant than bacteria, as I was listening to Linda Gorham speak. And so she felt that it would work a little bit, and yet if you don't have water, it sits there. So the opportunity of doing a soil test, work done in Manitoba when they were seeding into a stand legumes, if in fact it was deficient in phosphorus, when phosphorus was added, the seedlings were 4 times bigger. So the idea of phosphorus, if it's deficient, is really important to me. I saw a number of stands that were done in Saskatchewan in the 90s, I think, or early 2000s by Ducks Unlimited that were failings. And when you asked them about soil tests, they were done and they were phosphorus deficient. And so that kind of stuck with me. So no, I'd say that you're looking at a situation, if you're deficient, add, because it really will impact the seedlings. And don't get too carried away, because even phosphorus, though it's got low acid, it doesn't take much if it sits in a row to actually damage the seedling. So 25 pounds of product is probably a safe bet to go with. I know a lot of producers go higher, but that's still high. I probably missed one part of that, Amber.
Yes. Is there a better way to fertilize pastures other than broadcasting? Is there a different way to do that that's more efficient?
When the most efficient way to fertilize is always going to be make sure you don't lose what you got. And I know that many will say there is an immense bank in the soil that is present, that isn't being turned over. But if we are fertilizing, it is the phosphorus efficiency still occurs. It just takes longer. So somebody will say you can't put phosphorus, it's just on the surface. Well, it was actually work done in Montana, PJ, that showed that it just takes a bit longer. There are some quite shallow roots in any perennial forage stand that does access the phosphorus, but it was about 3 years to get the benefit of one application. So stepwise, phosphorus put on the surface. The problem is nitrogen, because nitrogen and it volatilizes it, and urea. And so people look at nitrogen stabilizers, but lo and behold, that buys you a window of time at a pretty good cost. So is it merited or not? Banding it in, yeah, that'd be a lovely way of doing it. It's a lot of cost to do it. So I kind of look at it from the standpoint, if I was going to add legumes to the stand, that would be the time when I brought the crew in with the drill. I would probably consider then, if I was going to add a fertilizer blend to a stand too, I would do it. In high value crops were around where I am at Innisfail, where we've got densified hay produced, they do go out and use Flexicoil 6000 or others to band in their fertility. But applying on the surface late in the fall or very early in the spring, hoping a rain is coming tomorrow. I wish we had 3400 back. If you need any sulfur, switch to 200021. I've got my numbers wrong, maybe 200024, because it isn't the volatilizing that 46 is.
Awesome. Calvin asks from McCord, Saskatchewan, have you ever found data to quantify the microbial levels in the swath grazing or planned fall grazing?
Found data to look at microbial levels in fall grazing or swath grazing?
Yes, correct.
Oh, no. I really wish we did, because if I believe we've got more urine recaptured, to me, that tells me I'm going to have more organism activity because I'm feeding a system. And so my thought on it is it should be more. And with that in mind, one of the things I think they did find in a number of ways, and there's still papers coming out on it at the University of Alberta, they did find the adaptive multi-paddock grazers across 3 of the prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, did have better water infiltration. And if they have better water infiltration, I think something to do with plant vigor, and plant vigor translates in my way of thinking of feeding soil organisms, because it's root exudates and roots that build soil organic matter mostly, more than the residual people always thought on the surface. So there isn't the work done, but there's, and Kelvin is a real student of this himself, I know. So my thought is that it's a no-brainer.
Paul asks, is there a difference between cow manure, urine, and horse versus or compared to horses applied as mob grazing in a mob grazing situation?
Mob grazing horses?
That's how the question's asked. Yes, Paul, maybe you can speak on that a little bit more.
Please, yeah. Paul, do you want to speak, or if you want to say something in the chat again, I will answer it to my best of my ability.
Paul just said, hold on. I think he's maybe getting his mic and stuff figured out here.
So you go up into your right-hand corner where the dots are, and you've got mute and unmute, but okay. It could be that your speaker down at the bottom on your bottom menu needs to be pressed up and move to a higher level for a mic, but I don't, go ahead, Amber.
In the meantime, maybe while he's working on that, we can just go to the next question.
All I'll answer is a little bit on it so we don't pass it right over. The difference between a horse and a cow in how much urine, nitrogen, urine potassium, urine phosphorus, which is really in the fecal in the manure, and sulfur, to all of that, I don't know the differences. I know that both animals end up being such that they use very little of what comes in. And the idea of using very little, whenever you smell urine, and I've got horses too, and I know that I would have to say the reality is that there is a lot of nitrogen in the urine. The poorer the quality, and Paul just put something up about winter, the poorer the quality of the forage, the more nitrogen will be balanced a bit more towards the manure. So if I had to say something, I'd say, okay, 70% of the nitrogen is in the urine, 30% in the manure. Maybe it does get to be 50-50 if they're on a pasture that's 5% crude protein, 6% crude protein, then more of it would be in the manure, maybe half and half. And what else did Paul put up? I never caught it fully, Amber, an explanation.
There we go. He got some horses mobbed a pasture over the winter, and the grass is coming up better than where the cows had mob grazed an area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Goodness, I don't have an answer for that. And horse would graze severely, a cow couldn't graze as severely. A cow, of course, using a tongue and one set of teeth, horse using 2 and can get closer to the ground. Maybe they did take more material off even, I'm not sure, but horses, as I know, are pretty, oh yeah, Kelvin's just put something in, it could well be more spread out. Maybe they do go fecal amounts more often or urine amounts more often than a cow, I'm not sure.
Okay, next question. I asked, have you done any work with soil testing on land that has been swath grazed versus fertilized with hoe drill? What do you find the comparison between the two? Is the fertilizer more evenly distributed with the drill versus the swath grazing?
Definitely. The cattle, in fact, on swaths, as we know, try to walk the swaths more. So you do try to move your swaths over from year to year with your swather by cutting a smaller pass and then start or something like that. The where you go back to water, you've got more manure and urine. Where there's shelter, you've got more manure and urine. So it could well be in valley where they're out of the wind. So the higher the stocking rate, the more rapid the moves, the more uniform the manure and urine. However, there is no doubt that the trails and the swaths are much more impacted than in between them, and fertilizing would in fact be more uniform.
Next question, what would be the best way to improve productivity for acidic soil?
Find the legumes that can grow in that acidic soil to add to it, because that in itself is an opportunity to add nitrogen to the system. And to me, that is going to be the biggest step to improving the productivity, other than planting fence posts and grazing in a way in which you are giving it more rest, so that those plants are in fact more vigorous and accessing the soil profile deeper and shallower.
Does anyone else have any other questions, comments, conversations?
Can you hear me, Amber?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, lime. You want to talk about lime, Grant?
The use of lime is something that was very common many years ago as people looked at doing it to address the acidity. And the fact is, what it does is it reduces a lot of the tie-ups that you've got from an acid soil. Just simply has more problems, as was said in this chat. So the lime is a tool. The cost of the lime, gypsum or whatever form you can get it at and such, is a means of addressing it with enough quantity put on. And the idea behind that is it does open the door to a lot more nutrients being available. So good point, Graham. But the cost of it, and I think, I don't know, Graham, did you, I don't know if I was with you and that gentleman was telling us he'd looked into it and he couldn't afford it this year?
Yeah, no, he couldn't afford it this year. Like everything else, it's gone through the roof. But we used to put a lot of lime. There's about 4 ton an acre every 2 or 3 years that really sweetened up the soil back in New South Wales. One thing that we're kind of experimenting in is with biochar now as well. If Daryl's on the line, I'm in the truck. So if Daryl's on the line, he might be able to address that more as well.
He isn't. I don't see him here.
No, not tonight.
Okay.
He's on. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, we used to use a lot of lime. We flew it on by the truckloads, and it really responded. The soil and the clovers really responded really well to that. The application, and the paddocks that we didn't do, they were set back. So yeah.
No, certainly the lime is the one tool that I overlooked. Good thing Graham caught it.
Another comment to add to the acidic soil. She says, or should I say fungi dominant soil?
I don't know enough to say. Um,
Yeah.
a lot of our soils, we don't have enough fungi. I know with my benchmarks, I was really low, and Daryl Chubb, as Graham alluded to, the ratios. He also looks at quite a bit. So there's no doubt that the fungi in many ways is, I kind of say, the high-speed internet of the soil. So it can do a lot of things for you to get things sorted out, but you've got to have it. And part of it is build it and they will come. So it is a challenge to get it there. That's why any method, but you have to have the habitat for it. And though we'll put it on forage seeds because it's just a no-brainer to do everything we can to help the cause. Because as I said, earlier when we were talking about if I'm going to run a drill over the land and put fertilizer in, I might as well add some legume seeds at the same time. The point of the fungi is a change of management, a change of grazing, and really wanting the integration of the livestock, because what is a rumen full of? It's full of a multitude of microorganisms, bacteria, protozoa, fungi, and such. So all of that to transfer into the soil.
Alvin asks, with the cost of fertilizer this year, as an advisor for cover crops or interseeding legumes into grass stands, what do you feel is the long-term advancement of the stand in a comparison cost formula?
We put some things up here that just showed 100 pounds of nitrogen and a legume, in fact, equating to that. So my mind, I am looking at plants feeding soil and that liquid carbon. So I would rather have different plants. Different plants are going to have different exudates, but they'll also have different exudates at different times, or exudates even at times with different needs or stresses, warning other plants about grasshoppers, even, for goodness sake. So I guess I'd look at the plants and the legumes first, and thereafter, if it's deficient that I can't establish them, then I would have to put fertilizer first. Anything else?
I have, Grant.
I have one more comment, I guess. Grant was talking about, stocking accordingly. So we kind of look at our critical rain dates, May and June down here. And, last year we were 50-60% behind on our percentage on our rainfall. So, some other guys down here, they look at that, well, you should be 50-60% understocked if you don't have the rain in them critical rain dates. And what's your thoughts on that, Grant? I mean, it's pretty tough to argue with that, but I mean, that's kind of where we're at.
Depending on your management over time, in the past, there always was conservative use. And so then it allowed for an opportunity, in fact, remedial, if you call it, or such. I guess my thought on that would be I would probably look to group herds and maybe raise at times a little more severely and get them out of there. And so doing, I would try to get not just severely, but using the areas better. And if in fact I had to, and we did last year, we fenced some of our lowland into the system so that we could put the cows there to buy days. And we tried to do it early enough so the quality was still there. So when you miss a critical rain date, now you know you're in trouble. There is still the resilience in the stand, and a healthy, vigorous stand when you have is not going to go down the full depth of the lack of rain. It'll go a portion of that. As you all know, we get lower fiber, and animals' pounds of meat that come off per acre actually go up, or per animal particularly, I guess I'd say. So, but it is a case where, you know, you're buying time, but you got to be careful on how much time you try to buy it if you don't have it, from which stands can give it.
So last year, you know, if it stays cool and it rains all summer, some of them perennial pastures will stay green longer. But, you know, when you're running into the heat and the grasshopper issues, and I'm trying to get over this ground and I cannot get over it fast enough before it dries out. So we ended up swathing a bunch and just laying it in the windrow to capture the nutrients, and then we grazed the swaths, and that worked because the year before it all turned to sticks and there was nothing, I couldn't get over it fast enough, you know. So that worked, but normally it's just, I guess I'm just trying to, I run into trouble trying to get over it fast enough before it dries out, you know.
Well, and there's no doubt, and the other is true, I guess, in the Peace Country where it grows so fast, you can't get over it fast enough. But you're right. Once it's got the maturity on it, laying it down in a swath, it's going to be very poor quality to be in a swath, and the cattle won't want to eat it. So laying it down earlier, so you've got the quality in a swath and capturing that time is an alternative to do it. I've let it get mature, but then I have to use protein supplement, and I can do it every 3 or 5 days. Actually, it's kind of Kent Olson's work out of Utah showed that even 5 days could be a speck more efficient, though not significantly different than 3 days. I would be careful on younger cows, but maybe it is a case where corn DDGs and Sean, you were doing some of this. So if is Sean still on the call? But I'm looking at cost-effective supplementation, and that's where every 3 to 5 days, preferably. So because the thing you did, PJ, that was good, the minute I start in hauling supplement out to cows, I erode the profit big time, big time. And so if I can do it every 5 days, or if I can get part of it down so that I've kind of played a bit of a game. And with me, it ended up being, I just said, okay, and I never did make it to the one piece until too late. And so when I put them in there, I should have had a protein supplement with them. The tubs are very expensive if they're used. There's no question that protein gets recycled by saliva and the liver. So the liver will take that ammonia and recycle it. So when you are feeding an animal adequate amounts on every 3 days or 5 days to average over the days that are missed, the animal does recycle and meet its needs. And I have found if I can't meet the needs, if I move them every day, somehow or other, it still works somewhat. But yeah, the problem is capturing it and holding the quality. And it sounds to me, PJ, you're doing a pretty good job of that.
These were all on stocker cattle, and they were all on our perennial hay fields. Of course, the heat was moving in and the grasshoppers were moving in, so I had no choice but to swath it down, capture the feed value. And I'm not, you know, I don't like to spend money on protein tubs. That's going to, you know, start costing me money. So it worked. It worked last year, and I made the mistake the year before by not doing that. So
the protein tubs are too expensive, and hope I'm not hurting somebody's feelings on this call. But other than if you're using them in just as a salvage tool a little bit, and to me, I'm always going to try to look at, I have used urea mineral, and you got to be a little careful with that. I messed up and I did kill 2 cows 2 years ago. So you've got to be very consistent with what you do, because that's what I was doing, PJ, on that very mature forage. Is I was going out there as often as I could and supplying the mineral that was half urea, and that's high. And I got a couple days where I had to haul water to them instead, and I forgot to do the urea mineral, and then I put it back out. And the 2-day break, I killed one, and we did post-mortem. We couldn't tell though, but I'm pretty sure the 2 I lost were from that. So you got to be careful. I know now that Graham does use some urea, but he uses lower amounts in the mineral, and it's a lot more cost effective. Mind you, at the price of nitrogen now, I don't know if it is as cost, but it's still more cost effective than tubs. But it can just do a little touch up, not a lot.
Very good. Thank you. Very knowledgeable. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone for being on the call tonight. And if you would like the recording link or anything like that, please email me and I'll be happy to pass on that information to you. And we will see everyone back next week on Thursday, and PJ is going to be speaking with us.
Thank you, everybody. Best of luck.